Cupid. An alien sci-fi romance. A Tale in the Colony series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. Orel took a deep breath, then forced it out slowly. He couldn't delay any longer, it was now or never. He'd seen Anna head into the staff break room only a minute ago, and if he waited any longer, someone else would venture in there for a coffee and he'd miss his chance. Now man now. He stumbled on the first step, then righted himself and kept going. If he missed this chance, he'd be letting Cupid's curse win. Orel rounded the corner, drawing in another breath before he said, "Oh hi Anna. I was wondering." She turned around and he stopped dead at the sight of tears streaming down her face. Silent tears, because if he'd heard her crying, he wouldn't have barged in here and… "What's wrong?" he asked instead. She smiled through her tears. The first real smile he'd ever seen on her face in the year he'd worked with her. Possibly her first smile since her husband's death. "Oh nothing," she said, swiping at her cheeks. "I've just had the most wonderful news, and I can barely believe it. After all this time, it turns out my husband was still alive in an escape pod. A salvage crew found him and the hospital wants me there when he wakes up. Valentine's alive, Orel, and I get him back on Valentine's Day. I'm so happy I could cry." A fresh flood of tears washed down her cheeks, but there was no mistaking that joyful smile. How could he be anything but happy for her? "That's amazing news," he blurted out. "What did old Earth mystics call it? A miracle, that's what this is. It's not often the universe brings someone back from the dead." She laughed softly and wiped her eyes. "We bring the dead back to life every day here, or at least I do. Have you never been into my lab, or the Lost World biome? I can give you a tour, or maybe you could even work a day with me next week, if you like. I'm sure someone else could cover your duties for a day." Orel found himself nodding politely, not wanting to ruin her day with his whining. A concussed monkey could cover his duties most days here in Eden. If the robot rebellion in the Titan system could have waited a few more weeks, he'd have finished his MBA, and he wouldn't have to work as a glorified gopher. If they'd waited another year, he'd have been able to pocket a tidy profit from the first year's sales of Professor Poulet's latest chimera. But they hadn't, and then Poulet had perished on the Titanic, so now he was the Eden Lab's errand boy at the beck and call of everyone who had a PhD, especially… "Oh hello Lilith." "Hi Anna. Have you seen Orel anywhere?" Lilith entered the break room. Anna gave a little wave and left. "There you are. Rokel's on the warpath because your bloody birds are still in his biome, when he wanted it for his project yesterday," Lilith said. If Eden Labs had a prima donna, it was Rokel, though he was definitely no lady. Orel wasn't sure what Lilith saw in him, but he knew better than anyone that love could blossom in the strangest places, so he kept his opinions to himself. Perhaps Rokel had redeeming features he showed to no one else but Lilith. "I told Dr. Rokel I'd have the birds out for farm testing by the end of today. If he'd told me before 4 a.m. this morning that he wanted that biome, I might have been able to meet his timeline, but as it is…" Orel shrugged. "I can't work miracles or time travel. I had intended to have my lunch break first before I did the afternoon deliveries, but if it's so urgent, perhaps I could do the deliveries first." Lilith's tense shoulders dropped as her breath hissed out. "Thank you. He's you know how he is. Especially about his top-secret projects." Orel did. He also knew more about those top-secret projects than most of the other staff, because he'd had to procure all manner of strange things for Rokel's projects. Always with impossible deadlines he could never meet, so it was no wonder everyone in Eden believed he was an incompetent idiot. Never mind that he met Rokel's demands 9 times out of 10, which was more than anyone else could do. No, he was stuck here in Eden, because he'd never get a good reference from anyone here that would let him get another job anywhere. I'll get right on it, Dr. Lilith, Orel said. If you could tell Rokal his biome will be ready and sanitized by the end of the day? Lilith nodded, worry creasing her forehead again. I will, but he won't like it. She hurried out before Orel could form a reply. Probably a good thing, or he might have been tempted to tell her to dump Rokal and find someone who made her smile instead of stress. Lilith was an intelligent woman, she'd work it out for herself eventually. He hoped. As Orel headed for the bird's biome, he pulled out his tablet to schedule a thorough clean for it. He figured he could get the birds caged up and out of there in less than an hour, so setting the wash cycle to start in 60 minutes seemed reasonable. 23 minutes later, Orel smugly guided the hovercart of crated birds out of Eden and on their way to their new homes. Professor Poulet, may the stars rest his soul, would have been proud. A pity he'd never lived long enough to see these chimeras reach their final stage of testing. Once they'd passed this, they'd be ready for full commercialization on every planet, station and ship in the Alton system. I agreed to have chickens in my garden. Those don't look like chickens. What's that on its back? Are they supposed to be green? What did you say they're called again? Every time Orel released the chimeras from their box, the questions started flying. Every single person who'd agreed to accept a flock knew that they were experimental, engineered birds from Eden, found nowhere on Earth, but the moment they saw them. Orel sighed. We call them chicken salads, he'd explained to Ghost, as he backed out of the specially constructed pen in the man's garden in the Arbor Dome. It looked like it was made from the surrounding trees, but timber was too precious to waste on livestock. Synthwood most likely, which didn't smell as fragrant as trunks that had once been full of sap. Or those that still were, crowding around him as if to listen to his explanation. They're genetically engineered chickens that are both a food source and an enhancement to normal waste disposal facilities aboard a spaceship or station. In fact, they're currently thriving on many Titan ships as we speak. Are they safe for my son? Ghost demanded. Orel hesitated. The chimeras behaved like ordinary chickens, which meant they pecked and scratched like any of their Earth counterparts. The food they produce is as safe as anything else grown here in the colony, but they are animals, which will defend themselves if they are manhandled. A peck or a scratch, or maybe a wing buffet. How old is your son? Only 6 weeks, but everyone keeps telling me kids grow so fast, he'll be walking before I know it, and into everything. He looked both excited and alarmed at the prospect. If Ghost thought human babies grew fast, he should see the herd of cows at Byron's ranch. Scant months ago, they'd been newborn calves wobbling around on unfamiliar legs, but they were now almost full-grown and grazing on the grasses that grew in the arid soils in the farms beneath the arena dome. Yes, they're supposed to be green, Orel had told Byron and his partner Rana, trying not to cough in the dust the cows had kicked up when they'd seen him and stampeded off. Evidently they remembered him from Eden, expecting him to give chase, but he didn't have time to play today. They're a lot like Earth chickens, just engineered to undergo photosynthesis, hence the leaves on its back. Those are edible, by the way, like a kind of leaf lettuce. I'm not sure how well they'll do in the dry heat here, the leaves that is, not the birds. As long as the birds get enough water and food, they'll be fine. In space they use those leaves to make energy when food is scarce. Food wasn't likely to be scarce for the chimeras here in the colony, whether in Ghost's forest, Byron's desert or the tropical plantation Phoebe maintained where she planned to raise her chicken salads. Entering the farming level beneath the aqua dome was always a rude shock. Unlike the dry, dusty heat that blasted him in the face when he stepped onto Byron's ranch, the plantation humidity landed on his shoulders, pressing him down like one of the large parrots in the Amazon biome, or the ghost of heavier gravity in the greenhouses back on Tito. Greenhouses that were gone now. Across the river lay Paddy's farm, as Triton called his rice terraces, though Phoebe insisted on calling the whole place the Grove. Her chicken salads would have free range throughout her plantation, so Orel released the birds among the trees, under Phoebe's watchful eyes. She simply nodded serenely at his spiel about the birds, their care, and anything else she needed to know. "And if there's any issues, call me and I'll be right over," Orel finished. "What are those things?" "If they come across the river and start ripping up my crop, I'll turn them into fertilizer." Triton stood on the riverbank, eyes flaming as he fixed his gaze on the green chimeras. "Chickens won't go anywhere near your flooded fields," Phoebe said scornfully. "They like their soil dry, so it's easier to scratch around in. And they eat the bugs that proliferate in that fetid swamp you call a farm." Her green eyes flashed, though nowhere near as luminously as Triton's. Triton scraped his shoe on the grassy bank, as if trying to rid it of something he'd stepped in. For a moment, he looked like a horse pawing the ground. "At least my farm's producing something. How many more years before your trees do more than just suck up water and shed leaves?" Most of the colony's trees, including Phoebe's plantation, were established at the end of the war, soon after the domes were sealed. After 4 years of accelerated growth, Orel was surprised they weren't fruiting already. He squinted at the nearest tree. "Actually, this year. They're hard to see now, but once they ripen, those mangoes will stand out so even your dull eyes won't be able to miss them," Phoebe said smugly. "HMPH." Triton stalked away. Orel thought he glimpsed hurt in the other man's eyes before he turned away. He'd better head off too, before he started imagining something between these two that ran deeper than neighborly rivalry. "Anything else you want to know about the birds before I go?" he asked. Phoebe dragged her gaze off Triton's retreating back, or was it his backside? There was longing in her eyes for a long enough moment for Orel to know he hadn't imagined it. Definitely something between them, a spark that would flare brighter with no help from him. All they needed was time. "I'm sure we'll be fine," she said vaguely, her eyes straying back to Triton. Orel said his farewells and made his way up to the Aquadome aircar station. Now his deliveries were done, he headed home to Eden, where he belonged. Nihal placed her hands on the vat, took a deep breath, then closed her eyes. Bubbles formed a froth atop the brew, as it should. Her consciousness dipped below the bubbles, circling through the ferment of honey, water, yeast, and alcohol, until she could almost taste its sweetness on her tongue. Not mature enough to bottle yet, but it would be in a few days. She'd check again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until she was satisfied though, because yeast were tricky little creatures, wildly productive one day and lazy little bums the next. She wouldn't finish up primary fermentation until the perfect moment, a moment she knew instinctively for each and every vat she made, from that first student brew at university. Her professors had been horrified, insisting that she couldn't possibly know the alcohol content inside the vat without testing it, so she'd taken and tested samples to satisfy them, but it hadn't changed the truth. She was a full-blooded water djinn with powers so weak they were laughable, but she could identify a drop of poison in an entire city reservoir, the pH of a wort going sour, or the contents of a cocktail with a touch. She wasn't a throwback, powerless human. She wasn't. "Sis, are you down here?" Ghost's voice broke Nihal's reverie. He'd never been in danger of being called a throwback. Ghost could dematerialize at will, traversing space wherever light waves could go. Stars, he might even survive a trip through a black hole, if the desire took him to explore such a thing. "No," she replied. "I'm not due to start work for a few hours yet. I'm at home, watching the news, and wondering if there's a headline Prometheus can't lace with innuendo." Ghost laughed. "If there is, I haven't heard it yet. I think he even had one when the war began." Nihal shook her head. "Something about the Titanic going down, and how we should all follow her valiant example. I remember because he was looking at me when he said it." She squirmed a little at the memory, which had ended with both of them sharing his bunk that night. When they'd lost so much, it had seemed like the most natural thing in the world to take solace in each other. For that one night at least. They'd never spoken about it since, let alone considered a repeat performance. And there never would be, it had been a one-night-only thing. Two people desperate for a connection, any connection, when it had seemed like they were alone in the universe. Now she knew better. With the war over and both humans and Titans to choose from, she could share her bed with a different man every night for a decade and still not make it through the colony's male population. Not that she'd ever considered it. She was more at home alone with her VATS here in the cellar at Forge than in the company of any man she'd ever met. Even Prometheus. Nihal? Colony control to Nihal, come in? She blinked. Since when do emergency services put you in the control room? You're a field officer. You'd be wasted in control. He grinned. Not since the last time I answered a call and headed out to deal with it myself while everyone else was off getting coffee, so no one was left in control. That was back on Tito. Her eyes met his. That's when you came to save me, wasn't it? He ducked his head. Of course. No rebellious robots were going to get their metal mitts on my sister. If he hadn't come for her, she might never have made it to the Titanic, or the relative safety here in the colony. She wouldn't be alive now if it weren't for him. Stars, she couldn't start crying now. What are you and Maya doing for Valentine's Day? She asked. He hesitated, then answered in a rush, we're going out to lunch, just the two of us while Christos is in the creche. I've taken a day off work so I won't be on call, and she's running a workshop that day, so she won't be doing any deliveries. It's our first actual date, what with everything that's happened, and I want to make it special. He coughed. I want to buy her a gift. Some jewelry. A ring? I want to. I mean, we have a kid together and everything, but I don't think she's ready for that yet. I'd marry her today if she wanted to. But, I thought, maybe a necklace or earrings or something. I don't know. I wouldn't know where to get them either. Jewelry. Something Nihal had never been able to afford much of, back on Tito. How their lives had changed. There's a human named Bridget. Her brother Hadrian is one of the arena champions. They come to Forge to celebrate when he wins, which is quite often. And every time she's wearing different jewelry. I asked her once and she said she makes it all herself. She had a jewelry making business on the side when they were working at the Exodus space dock, sourcing all manner of gems and metals from the mining vessels bringing raw materials for construction, and she packed it all up to take with her when she boarded the Genesis. If you ask her nicely, she might accept commissions or have something suitable already. Go seized Nihal and kissed her on both cheeks. You are the best, sis. Maybe I'll see if she has something I can give you for your birthday, if she can make something for Maya in time for Valentine's Day. I won't hold my breath, Nihal said dryly. I'm still waiting for my Christmas present from you. But Ghost had already gone. Brothers. Hers was enough to drive her to drink, even if she didn't have that first batch of bottled mead waiting to be tasted. But she had to work today, so she'd best wait until her shift at the bar was over. Managing Forge's bar was definitely a job that required all of her wits.